Okay, before we get started, thank you for letting me come to your classroom the other day and observe you during reading. I really appreciate it.
Of course.
So I plan for our conference to take about 15 minutes, but the duration of the conference will really depend on you and your responses to the questions that I'm going to ask in our discussion.
Okay.
So before we dive into it, just how do you think the lesson went?
I think it was a good lesson. They really enjoy the plants that eat animals. We've been learning about plants, but we haven't really talked about the fact that they can actually eat insects. They were engaged. The story, the illustrations and photographs really drew them into the book. And we had worked a little bit on compare and contrast, but we hadn't really dived into it yet. So I think it was a good lesson to really dig deeper into that comprehension skill. And they seemed to really get it. So I thought it went well overall.
Okay, so what part of, if you had to pick one part of your lesson that you could say, like, this went really well?
Probably just the ability to compare and contrast, because it seemed like they really could identify the similarities and differences, especially when one of my students discussed how, well, comparing is kind of when you're focusing on the similarities, and contrasting is when you're really looking at the differences.
Yeah.
And I think the example in the beginning with the visual of the
I
sock,
thought that was great.
yeah, I think that really, especially for some of the students that struggled with it, to visually see, oh,
Yeah.
okay, I can see how they're the same, they have the same use, but they visually look different.
And as you saw in the notes that I wrote, I put that there, that I thought that was great, using that
Yeah.
example in the beginning to kind of
Really
get them
helped.
honed in on that comprehension skill and giving them a visual. Okay, so that, you thought that went really well, content, things like that. Well, what do you feel didn't go so great?
I think the story was great, but it was a long story. So I think that, just pacing wise, and we've discussed too, just me in general with pacing in regards to a lot
Right.
of my lessons,
Mhm.
I really like to make sure they grasp every concept, but sometimes, as you know, on a day-to-day schedule in school, you have to
It's
stay
hard,
on
yeah.
an agenda and on a certain concept you want to address, but you have other areas to teach like science or math.
Right.
So I think pacing was kind of hard for me because I maybe stay too long in certain aspects or focus on one of the plants too long, and then I looked at the clock and I was like, oh boy, it's almost writing time.
Right.
So pacing, I think, was definitely maybe a downfall.
Right, and as you saw, again, that was kind of my thinking too. I know we did discuss that in our pre-conference about pacing
Yeah.
and how that is an area that, you know, you feel like you need some work in.
Yes.
And so the story is a long story. I thought maybe we could maybe shorten it, only do it half of the story, a couple other
Good
things.
idea.
Or even like when you were doing the examples on the board, I thought that was great. I wrote down in my notes that it was good for, you know, your different levels of learners to be able to actually see what your expectations were, but maybe only do a couple examples for each
No,
plant.
for sure.
Or maybe just do 2 plants and let them go and add that other plant in with your activity that you did at the end. All right, so did your materials meet the activity and group your objective?
I feel like they did. I think the activity afterwards, which assessed their ability to compare and contrast the different plants, was good. They did do it with a partner, so
Yep.
you know, I had to kind of walk around in order to be able to make sure both were contributing and both kind of understanding and comprehending what they were doing.
Yeah.
But it seemed like they could draw from the text different facts and then compare and contrast the two. So I think it was a good.
And as I walked around during the lesson too, when they were working with partners, they did understand the vocabulary that you introduced, and they were able to use that, the comparing and contrasting and how things are alike and how things were different. So I thought that was really great too. So you feel that the students did master the learning
I did.
objective?
I walked around and they did turn it into me.
Okay.
I do have some examples. And they did do it. I didn't have any students. I had some that kind of focused too much on just like focusing on listing everything about that one and listing everything about the other, and not kind of identifying, okay, but how are they similar or different?
Right.
You know what I mean?
'Cause
They were
they
just
need to have
listing
that
facts. So I made
discussion.
sure if I thought maybe a student didn't get that, well, you're comparing two things, not just writing facts about it. That's the only little thing
Right.
I needed to make sure. And I pulled a small group to just assess that during small group in the morning using a story, and they all seemed to get it.
Okay. And this strategy, the compare and contrast strategy, was that the first time they had seen that, or?
We had talked about it. We had done
Okay.
it just kind of like that, but not where they sat down and then did it on their own.
Okay, awesome. So, judging by our discussion, would you agree that based on the evidence that we've talked about, the areas of strength, do you feel like the areas of strength for this lesson is that the students understood the learning, like the content, they
Yeah.
were engaged?
I think definitely the text helped because, like I said, that really drew them in
Yeah.
to kind of wanting to apply the skill. But yeah, if I was to say, did my students master the objective of that day? I believe they did.
Right. And then, like we talked about in the pre-conference about pacing and staying on in that time frame, would you agree that based on what we've discussed, what I observed, and your reflection on the lesson, that an area that we may need to improve on would be keep
100%.
pacing and figuring out those little hints or little things that we can do to,
Like you said, shortening the book or.
Yeah.
No,
or
I
maybe
totally
not as
agree.
many, not as many examples for each plant, or maybe only do a couple plants. Okay, good. So, well, I know we discussed that, and another area that I know we talked about is maybe getting more students involved. Kagan structures are really big in our district, and I was thinking that for our next coaching cycle, if we focused on pacing, but also focused on student engagement, and how to get more than just a couple students involved, sharing out maybe a pair share or
No,
something
that's a
like
really
that.
good idea.
Okay, so do you feel like the goals we discussed during our pre-conference, during this coaching cycle were met?
I believe so.
Okay, and then is there anything else that you would like to focus on in our future coaching cycle besides the student engagement and pacing?
No, I think that's really good, because I think
Okay.
in regards to pacing, involving the students will help with pacing, because maybe I can just quickly observe more.
Right.
Who's mastering it and not have to worry so much about me doing whole group.
Right.
It might, speed up the lesson as well.
Okay, perfect. Well, thank you so much for meeting with me today. You did
course.
great. I was really
Oh,
impressed.
thank
So,
you.
alrighty, thank you.
Thank you.